welcome back for another episode of Education in Focus. Today we will be exploring shame, what it is, how it impacts on children in school, and what school can do to support a child who experiences shame. So, when we say shame, what do we mean?
Well, it's a big question, isn't it? But I suppose shame is something everyone experiences. So I guess the thing is for us and our children, it's just how they perhaps can't manage it or don't have the tools that they need, because we can all experience a sense of shame from things that we might have done in the past, but we can usually get past it. Most of us, because we get the support and we've had that secure attachment probably in our early lives to enable us to do it. And also it's the part that a lot of it comes down to the internal working model, I think, doesn't it, really? It's a big difference between that and like guilt. You can feel guilty about something, but shame is massive. I think comes down to, I think, how you view yourself.
I think it's a really good question. And I'll be honest, like when we started planning for this podcast, I thought, what is the actual definition of shame? Because we talk about it an awful lot. And I went off and I had a little bit of a look, and psychologists have got different opinions of what it is, and philosophers have got different opinions about what it is. They can split it up into subcategories and talk about the difference between shame
Mm.
and guilt and shame and embarrassment and whether other people have to be there and all of this, that, and the other. And I just thought, this is far too complicated, because when I use shame in this context, I talk about a child feeling bad about themselves. And I don't really need to differentiate how they feel bad about themselves, or whether they're feeling bad about themselves in public or in private. I just know that shame is that feeling when we recognize that there is something, or we think that there is something bad about ourselves, be it, you know, who we are at our very core level, or be it an action that we've just done, or something that we've just said, or how intelligent we are, or whatever. But just something that makes a child feel bad about themselves in some way, shape, or form, I think is shame. Um, and I will be honest, the psychologist and philosopher's discussion of it got a little bit above my head. So
But that's a really good one. I think that's a really good definition. And simple is always better, isn't it? Really, when it comes down to managing it on a day-to-day basis. We don't want to be getting into deep philosophical arguments, surely.
no, and especially if we're going to have to communicate what we mean to people
Mm,
who perhaps haven't thought about it as much, like education staff, simple is best.
Absolutely agree. So yeah, it's about that. I agree. It's basically what a child, how they view themselves, and in the case of lot the children we can think about here, it's they generally don't think of themselves as particularly worthy or worthwhile or worthy of love. And we probably all know this, don't we? The bottom line is, if they've not been treated properly at those early years, either through neglect or through abuse, or whatever, or a combination of those things, it's the adults have treated them badly, so therefore I must be bad. You don't realise that the complex psychology that does go on in the background, even in very young children, it's kind of eye-opening. You realise that they can't see that it's the adults. They just think it's them, because children are so egocentric. In me, there
Yeah.
must be some reason the adults have done that, because I deserved it. I deserve not to be looked after or fed or whatever. Um, and then probably other adults have let them down at times. Maybe if they've gone into the care system, chances are they've been bounced about a bit. That's kind of reinforced it.
And I think it's also reinforced by our use of language. And it's really hard to get away from this. But how often do we say things like, oh, good job, or that's really good, or you're such a good child, and they can just be throwaway comments sometimes, and it's very difficult to be conscious of them 100% of the
Yeah.
time. But we are quite often attributing a child's goodness to something other than themselves. So they can unwittingly come to understand that their goodness depends upon them being a
Mm.
certain way, or doing a certain thing, or reaching a certain level, never more so than in schools, which I'm sure we're going to go on to. So we can give all of that kind of, linguistic reinforcement without ever actually meaning to. And that's going to exacerbate it if children have already come to the conclusion that because of the way the adults treated them in the past, there must be something wrong with them.
Mm. Absolutely.
I think it's quite a pervasive and overwhelming thing to experience as well, especially as a child. This feeling that you are inherently bad or inherently worthless. that must be all consuming in those times that they are
Mm,
triggered into shame.
yeah, and they're doing so much to protect themselves, then, aren't they, the children? So I guess that's where the behaviours come from a lot of the time, isn't it? It's that trying to protect themselves from further shame or further reinforcement of those
Mm.
beliefs. So it's kind of don't come near me, get away, which is when it becomes aggression, perhaps,
Yeah.
or curling up in a ball of withdrawal, that kind of stuff.
I mean, as an adult, I've certainly experienced shame, and I know how it makes me feel, and it makes me feel
Mm,
horrific. And it can be really hard to face up sometimes if you have done something wrong, think that other people around you have done something wrong. And as an adult, there is a really strong temptation sometimes to lie or blame or pass the buck
Mm.
or avoid it
mm,
in some way, shape, or form. Um, but I have a small ability to be able to work out what's going on. But I mean, recognizing that you're not perfect, recognizing that you might have done something wrong, or thinking that someone else thinking that someone else thinks you've done something wrong. It really,
Yeah.
really hurts.
mm,
It's just horrible.
yeah,
Um, and I do think that many of our children feel it an awful lot more strongly than I do.
yeah. I mean, we can sometimes take things personally, can't we? Even though rationally we shouldn't. But
Yeah,
it's that thing where someone doesn't see you in the street or look like looking away from you, and you think, oh, I know them, but why am I looking away? Must think, oh God, what's the matter? What have I done wrong? And all that
yeah.
kind of stuff starts up around your head. But and perhaps we can manage it better. But yeah, for those children, it could be so many things. Keep remind them, make them put them back into that position, and it's like you say, it's really hard because we often do it really with the best intentions. We do it unintentionally, don't we? Because that language that we might use puts them back into that position. Um, Even though it might desperately be trying to help them as much as we can.
I think it's also important to recognize that it can come with a real physical element. So you've spoken there, Jason, about kind of like, it might come out as, aggression or kind of like freezing and curling up and withdrawing. But I don't know about anyone else, but if I'm feeling shame, I get a real gnawing at the pit of my stomach. Like there's just something
Mm,
wrong. It's just not, I don't
Hmm.
physically feel right. So, as well as having those racing thoughts, as well as feeling all those big emotions physically, I'm not feeling great
mm,
either because there's something off kilter, there's something off balance. And it is one of those emotions, I think, that can
Mm.
physically affect you.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
I find it makes me like sort of very, very demotivated. Don't want to do anything. Can't face anything.
Yeah.
Suddenly want to
Yeah.
stop, lose
A
interest.
bit like
Yeah,
paralysis.
it is. You kind of think, well, what's the
Yeah.
point? Can't build So yeah, I guess it's sometimes maybe worthwhile as adults sometimes trying to remember what it's like because we experience it to help us get that insight into where the children might be at the
Yeah.
time.
And so many of our children complain of headaches and tummy aches, don't they? And you can't see those things, but I do, it is potentially worth exploring. Is that gnawing feeling at the pit of your stomach, like you said, Lisa, or is it that your head feels so full and so busy that that's the only way our children know how to describe that physical response?
Yeah, because they are learning about emotions. That ability to tell what your body's doing
Mm.
on the inside is something that we
Yeah.
learn over time. And it is very hard for children to differentiate between things like hunger or thirst, or actually whether there's an emotional response. I mean, again, I go back to the fact that, even as adults, we don't have this sorted because I'm sure there are many, many, many adults out there that emotionally
Yeah.
eat.
Mm,
You're feeling an emotion, and what do? You
Mm.
put something in your belly because that's going to make it feel better. Well, our children are however many years behind us in that learning and that understanding about what their body's trying to tell them. And so I think you're right, Lee. Things like saying I have a tummy ache or I have a headache. Yes, we can look to those physical things that it might be, but we can also start to explore about whether it's coming from an emotional place as well.
I
mm,
guess just for all the parents out there as well, we aren't saying that there aren't also times when a child says they have a tummy ache or a headache, and you can't exactly prove if they do or they don't, and they know that that's a day at home. We do. It's not all attributable to shame or emotions.
So many people had a tummy ache first thing on a Monday morning when they had maths with me. I know, I know.
um, I guess you kind of started to touch on it really, but I wanted to ask you both how you thought that the school environment could exacerbate that shame for our adopted children. Lisa, you've spoken about a little bit about putting praise onto children and how they can attribute that and perceive that. So I guess talk about that a bit more if we can, but also what other things happen in school that can really throw children into this shame.
I think I have to have a little bit of a caveat before I
Hmm.
go into this, because I might mention quite a few things, and I am not saying that schools shouldn't do them, but I'm saying that if they're not handled correctly or well, then they could be a source of shame. And I felt that was really, really important, because one of the first things I'm going to
Yeah.
say is that as a secondary school teacher, I had to mark so much work, and that written feedback that I'm giving children on a weekly, if not a bi-weekly basis, could be a source of shame if I've not phrased my feedback particularly well. People would get things wrong. I would want them to get things wrong because it shows me where they don't understand it, and then I can help them understand it. So, it's a really important learning thing to get things wrong. But if I haven't written my feedback particularly well and they're reading that in isolation when I hand it back, that could be a real source of shame. You've also got the fact that, certainly in my experience in secondary schools, we test children a lot. There might be 10 quick questions on the start of the board as your starter activity. We might have an end of unit test. We might have an end of term test, an end of half term test. We might have the end of year test. At so many points along the way, we are giving children opportunities to be really pleased with how well they've done, or to really highlight the fact that they're struggling, and let them know they're struggling and remind them that they're struggling and that they find this hard or that they've got something wrong. And so, again, the way in which tests are administered and handled could be a source of shame. We've got things like when children don't, I was about to say toe the line. That's a horrible phrase, but do you know what I mean? When they don't kind of like meet the teacher's expectations of how they should be behaving, or something like that, then we've got the use of detentions or isolation rooms. And again, I'm not saying that schools shouldn't have the capacity to kind of like handle this. I'm saying how they are delivered and how they are handled need to be done really carefully, so they're not really, really shaming. Um, oh, and then as a maths teacher, set every single child in every single year will know how many sets there are for maths in their year, and they will know which set they are in. And then, because we test them so regularly, they will have a rough idea of where they are in the class as well. So there will be children out there who know that they are in set 6 of 6, and they normally get towards the bottom of that class. So in their year group, they are, you can't see my air quotes, but the language that they could be giving themselves is they are the stupid one. They are, and I think that is really shaming. I'm not saying we shouldn't have sets, because it's very hard to teach vastly mixed ability maths groups, especially as you come to things like GCSEs. But I'm saying they can be a source of real shame. So yeah, off the top of my head, there was some ideas. I don't know what you think from a primary school perspective, Jason.
Yeah, that was listening to that fascination. I completely agree. That with that final point actually about putting children into sets, and um, that there's lots of arguments, or have been arguments in the past about whether children should be streamed and set and so on, taught in different ability groups. But the evidence on whole says no, it doesn't work, particularly for younger children. Mixed ability groups generally benefit, which is still a massive challenge as a teacher because you've got a massive spread of children. But there are strategies and there are things that you can do to help um, deal with that situation. But even in a mixed ability class, even with all that sensitivity, and you don't call your groups, you don't give them particular group names, the children will automatically try and rank themselves in some form or other. They try and pick out who's the clever, who's not so clever, and this is the language they use. I'm not saying I would ever use that, but they will try and see where they fit in this pecking order, and they won't take long if they've got that sense of shame. It won't take long before they start to feel that they're near the bottom of the pile. I'm seeing air quotes again. Bottom of the pile, which they're not, of course, but that might be how they see themselves, and they will, no matter what you try and do in a classroom and how you don't, you know, ever show the abilities through the way you sort of structure the classrooms, you can still those children will generally try and they can see because they'll know who's getting the answers and who's confident. They'll see who's getting onto the challenge work and who's still working on the more sort of substantial work, or who's working with the teaching assistant. That's an interesting philosophical point too, because I've often talked about this when I work with teachers and trainee teachers. Think about you when you're using a teaching assistant, if you've got one, because the default is often to put them with children who are struggling constantly, and that can send a message somehow that they need that support or they're not worthy of the teacher support. That's not what the teacher's thinking, of course, but it can sometimes be again an unintentional message. So actually having the teacher working with that group sometimes is really lovely for their self-esteem and as a way of avoiding that sense of shame, because the teaching assistant can work with different groups. It doesn't have to be that constant model, but it often falls into that pattern. So
It also
yeah.
sends really strong messages to the rest of the class as well, because
Mm,
unintentionally the class can kind of come to that conclusion of, well, this is a group of children that need more help, and again, put them in
yeah.
a certain rank order within that classroom. And children do feel a great sense of shame about what they're like, about how their peers make them feel. um so again, I would second that sometimes I've had parents want the teaching assistant to kind of always be with their child, or to sit next to them, and admittedly that does need to be done in some cases. But I would also always try and advocate for, like you were saying, Jason, moving the teaching assistant, if you're lucky enough to have one, around, so that none of those messages are given out, either that this group of children are not worthy of the teacher's attention, or give the message to the rest of the class that they need more help.
Yeah, and I was also wondering about in early years, it's perhaps less obvious in reception and so on, but that still shame will be there because they won't be able to share. They'll probably have lack some of those social skills that other children have. They'll often be left out of games, or they won't be able to quite understand how to join in some games and play, or they'll try and dominate the game, and the children will get cross and they might lash out and scream and whatever and kick out because they do at that age, and walk away and they're left with no one to play with, and they'll get upset and cry and hide under a table or so the shame kind of manifests itself through that as well in early years too. And again, even though there's a lot more option for them to just go and explore and play in continuous provision, um, they're probably less conscious at that stage of the fact that they're different or they feel different, but begins to sort of show itself as soon as they start interacting with others. And that's really why it's so important as adults that we all, that's as parents and as educators, you've got to try and help model it and teach them some of those skills, deliberately teach them.
Yeah.
We know that children will develop naturally, but children we're thinking about won't have had those opportunities and will have huge gaps. And so, and we've said this before in other situations, haven't we, that a 5-year-old child might be a toddler in many other parts of that development. So you have to support them to get to understand some really basic social skills, even though they look for all the world, the way they present, as just a typical child of that age, but they're not. And so the shame will get worse if we don't do something at that stage as well.
I'm just listening to you there, Jason, and I'm thinking of how many times I've done break duty or lunch duty, and you can see the, gosh, I want to use air quotes again. This is really not good for a podcast, but you can see the popular children, and they're running around, they're playing football, or they're hanging around in their big group, and they seem from the outside to have a really solid friendship group, and they're happy and popular and all of that. And I've seen children kind of like on the sidelines, like looking
Mm,
on,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps those children who don't have friends to spend their lunch and break time with, perhaps wander around in the corridors on their own. And if going back to that question, how can the school environment exacerbate that shame? I think probably for some children that would make them feel quite bad about themselves.
Yeah.
Why can't they get involved?
mm,
Why doesn't anyone want to hang around with them? What are other people thinking about me because I'm always on my own, or I don't quite fit in? Why do I not quite fit in? And so, although initially in response to that question, I was thinking about what happens within the classroom, those unstructured times could also be sources of, well, could be quite shame inducing for some children.
Mm.
yeah, I think literally from the moment they walk in school to the end of the day, there are opportunity after opportunity for them, for their shame to be reinforced in some form or other. Again, not through any deliberate action, um, but often through just the systems and the processes and the way that people use language. And yeah, children themselves, other children can be really
What
significant
can anyone?
because they'll often blame them as well.
Yeah.
And if a child struggles to interact socially and can't make friends very easily, they often get the blame as well for things they probably haven't
Mm.
done. So they go, "Oh, it's so and so again. Oh, yeah, no, no."
Yeah.
And so these children get the label
Mhm.
as well as difficult or naughty. I hate that word, but it's one that other children might use. And again, it's not true, but again, it just reinforces in their mind if they think, "Well, I'm rubbish. I'm not worth loving." Oh, look, there, no one wants to play with me, so it must
Mm.
be true. And everyone keeps blaming me, so it must be true. So it keeps reinforcing it, and it's really, really difficult, isn't it,
You
to actually,
saying about other children,
deal with?
can be quite merciless at times. And like I remember this as a teacher and as a student. I'm not sure if it happened to you, but when you confidently give an answer that you are certain you are right in front of a whole class, and then the teacher points out that it's not right,
Oh.
then like the ribbing you can get from that can be quite merciless. And if it's not handled correctly as well, the teacher
Yeah,
could give that message that, gosh, what an idiotic answer that was. And that can be a real source of shame. For children who are struggling academically, who have actually put themselves out there, if it's not handled well when they get things wrong, that can give them really, in their mind, really quite clear messages about how not good they are.
Mhm.
mm,
So,
Completely echo what you've both said in terms of, we're not telling or asking schools to necessarily change things, but to hold them in mind. But I suppose for me, a little bit of a different approach in that there is one practice I see in schools that if any schools are listening to, I would really beg you to change, which is reward charts or similar. I've seen in schools,
yes,
there are smiley faces next to every child's name or a sad face if they've not had a good day. And that's there at the end of the day. And that child leaves with a sad face and or they haven't got the stars that other people have had on the board. Or and I used to be on it with one teacher. She'd draw a little square in the corner of the whiteboard. And if you kind of cross the line so many times in that lesson, your name would go in that box and you'd be getting a dissension. But that's there for the whole class to keep looking at and for the child to keep looking at. So I suppose we'll never tell schools what to do or how to be, but it's just a little plea, really, from me and from us that those reward charts and systems
hmm
really exacerbate shame, and ending a child who suffers from shame's day on a negative note, I can't imagine how hard it is to then walk back into that school in the morning.
yeah,
yeah, and you started my brain there down a whole load of tracks
hmm
of kind of the way in which rewards can, not always, but can be used in schools. So I've worked in a school where they used to reward attendance. So it was a priority from Ofsted actually. They had to improve their attendance. They had all these like reward things in place, and so there were kind of like attendance ceremonies within each class at the end of each week where children got rewarded for 100% attendance. Then it kind of went up to each term, and then there was like a big trip at the end of the year for the people who'd had 100% attendance for the whole academic year. I think that that's unhealthy in many ways, 'cause it's encouraging people to come in when they're not well. um, but I think for those children who perhaps are struggling in school, perhaps do find it difficult to make it in, perhaps have improved their attendance from something like 70% to something like 82%, that's really not taken into consideration like the improvement they've made or the struggles that they faced, and is actually just saying, well, in another area you're not good enough, are you?
hmm
And we also, almost every school I've worked in has had some form of merit system where you would have, merits or dojos for good work. And I'm actually seeing them being, they were used really, really well in my daughter's class last academic year. So I'm not outlawing them completely, but they can sometimes not be used well. They can be used as rewards very visually in front of the whole class, and also often great swathes of children will be overlooked because those children who perhaps are struggling might be rewarded for things that other children aren't, and that can leave children in the
Yeah.
middle, feeling very much kind of like their efforts go unnoticed. They're not worth as much because and so yeah, reward charts, merits, rewarding
Mm.
attendance, these can all be present in schools.
Yeah. I'll put my hands up here and say as a teacher, I used to use reward charts. I used to have the name on the board. I used to do all that sort of stuff, thinking it was perfectly fine until I knew better. Um, and even as a head, we used to have a good to be green sort of chart in the classroom where the names were up, and it was again. Now I think, can't believe we did that, because what was it doing to those others that will just suffer shame? It's always public. It's not a public matter actually. If someone's crossed the line in some form, it's an issue between you and them. Actually, I know there's a sense of, look, make an example of you, but the consequences could be quite negative elsewhere. And the good news is that a lot of the research that schools are now using is moving away from that system. A lot of it says it's not effective for other reasons. Other children suffer shame too, not just those who suffered care, been in the care system. So I think it is becoming less of a common feature, but it's probably still there in many schools anyway, I'm sure. Yeah, so, and then the attendance thing completely, I refused always as a head to do that. I just thought it was fundamentally unfair to have a reward system for attendance, because people did say, oh, we should try doing that. I said, no, because it's no one's fault if they're not there. If they're genuinely ill,
Yeah.
it's no one's fault. And like you say, for those who've made a real effort to get in and it's still not possible. I had a child with cystic fibrosis. What am I supposed to do there? She would often have illnesses because of the infection she would suffer. So she's never ever going to get to 100%, no matter what. And you just can't. Then you've got to sort of make fudged kind of rewards where you say, well, actually, for these children who are slightly different, we'll put a slightly different reward. And then who doesn't get that? And I think just forget it. It's not necessarily a rewarding effort or attitude in the same way. You can still recognise those children who are really keen and want to show their best at all times by coming to school, but they can be rewarded for their positive attitude and things. That's fine, but yeah, that attendance itself is just not a good measure of someone's worth, I think.
That's a really good sentence actually to finish it on. That attendance is kind of not a measure of someone's worth, because actually everything that we've said is not a measure of somebody's worth. The homework that they've handed in, the test that they got, the test result that they got, the set that they're in, the social skills that they have, how many merits they have, whether they got an answer right or wrong in class, all of that is not a measure of someone's worth. And yet schools can, I don't think any educator would deliberately be doing this, or I hope that no
No.
educator would do it, but schools, the way that they're set up, can be giving those messages to children repeatedly, day in, day out.
Yeah.
And as we said right at the very start, children learn from that, don't they? And they start to put together that their worth is tied to those things.
So I think we've started to touch on it really quite a lot in terms of friendships or aggression or hiding under the table. Those are some of the things that we spoke about. But I just wondered if we could explore a little bit more when children are in school and they're thrown into shame. How does that impact on them? What might schools see? Like what can it look like?
Can I answer an easier question first?
Yeah, I don't see why not. Can
Okay,
you
the
tell us what
easier
the
question.
question is first?
Yeah, the easier question is, what will making a child feel shame not do? And
Okay.
it won't make them feel happy.
Yeah.
It won't make them feel safe. It won't make them this perfect robotic little child who does everything right all of the time
Hmm.
and suddenly miraculously understands the work
Yeah.
and builds good relationships with you, isn't it? Like, none of that is going to happen. And I felt it was important to say that,
You're
because
right.
definitely when I
Hmm.
first went into teaching, I did think that, I hadn't really thought about what shame was, what it felt
Mm.
like for me or for other people. It was, you just kind of went
Yeah,
into
cool.
it, and I just kind of assumed that if you pointed out a child's mistakes and perhaps punished them for it, then they would, as I said before, toe the line and get back in, and it would all be absolutely
Yeah.
fine. And that's not it, and I just felt that was easier than saying what it can look
Yeah,
like.
that makes sense.
Um, But yeah, we did start to say, how it can impact a child. I think I've certainly seen a lot of complete disengagement
Mm,
um, from lessons or from school. Um, a complete disengagement with the work, um, and that could stem from that kind of feeling very, very angry.
mm,
So not wanting to do it, just to kind of like not do it,
mhm.
but also in many instances a complete disengagement because what is the point?
Yeah.
I can't.
Mm.
Mm,
Um,
Yeah, I think again, I think a lot of it comes down to that protection, them trying to protect themselves all the time.
mm,
So yeah, like you say, disengagement is massive as well. So they'll not do things because they don't want to expose themselves to that sense of ridicule because they think they can't do it. So rather than saying I can't do it or I need help or whatever, I'm just going to find other ways to avoid having to do that. Avoidance strategies are really very well
mm.
very well developed in many children. I need to sharpen that pencil again. I need to do this. I need to get up. I need to do. I need to, whatever. There's lots of reasons. That's on the sort of low end of scale, but it can be much larger. It can be more disruptive and more um, deliberately aggressive or sort of refusing to do tasks. It can be to that stage as well. So it's difficult. I mean, as a teacher, it's
Yeah.
really difficult to be faced with that. I'm
Yeah.
not denying it at all, and that's the same for the parents. I'm sure that when they have similar issues when they're at home
Mhm.
as well.
Sometimes you
Um,
can see some showboating as well, perhaps to other people that are there, like, well, I don't care about this. I don't care what you think,
yeah,
and
not bothered.
yeah,
It's fine. Okay.
and almost kind of like finding a role. Okay, well, I'm not good at this particular aspect, but I'm going to secure my position as the class clown or the one that everyone can look to, be. Well, I don't know, but just me kind of like trying to
Yeah.
find a
Mm,
different role. So yes, it can often be seen as a little bit of showboating, but again, it just deflects from that emotion of I'm not good enough because you're securing yourself elsewhere, aren't you?
Mhm.
And pretending that you don't care
yeah,
about it.
you're trying to get your self-esteem from somewhere else, which might be, like you say, true or an unhealthy form, but for them it might be just what they see as a way of getting something.
Mm.
Yeah, by the respect of or the attention of others, as you say, for being funny or silly. Um, yeah, that's quite
Mm.
common, isn't it? Um, there is an unusual one as well. Sometimes you do get the odd time when they might try to be the perfect pupil. Sometimes,
Yeah.
and it's also a shame that can be quite difficult because they will try to be everything really perfectly, but they put immense pressure on themselves, and as soon as they can't or manage something or something slightly goes wrong, it's complete
Mhm.
disaster.
Yeah.
The world has fallen apart, and they go from that to complete meltdown and cannot manage it.
Yeah, they haven't got the resilience for when things don't go well. And we all know that resilience is something that we need for life full stop, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
sometimes I've seen children who just look really sad all of the time.
Mm.
Just
Look a bit lost. They have
yeah,
that
lost.
lost look about them
Yeah.
sometimes, and it's really it's really upsetting when you see the child that on their face. And that's probably because they are lost. The reality is they are lost little soul, and it's very difficult to see that. I think that shame is probably the biggest. I would argue it's probably the biggest source of a lot of the challenging behaviour that children who've been adopted or even still looked after are experiencing. That's probably where it comes from. The manifestation of it is probably. I think shame is probably the biggest part of it.
I agree.
So it is.
And I think, you've mentioned, Jason, that sometimes that shame can manifest in behaviours designed to push you away as adults and to
Hmm.
avoid you
Yeah.
and to solidify what the child thinks that you think about them. And all of these behaviours, they're not pleasant. They don't make children
Yeah.
likable. And so it's
No.
really hard, but equally necessary, I think, when we see a child showing those behaviours that are making us want to recoil and move away, to remember that that's the time they need us most.
It's really hard, isn't it? Because that sense of don't come near me, you don't want to see what I'm really like because it's so
Mm.
horrible. Keep away from me. So I'll do that by avoiding you or being aggressive and making myself so unpleasant. So you just want to keep
Mm.
away. So yes, it's a sort of maladaptation. I suppose you call it maladaptation. Um, a way of protecting yourself. And again, that can lead to mental health issues. So we're getting quite difficult stuff. This is not nice. It's
No,
quite
No.
heavy stuff, isn't it?
it is really heavy.
But really
Yeah,
important.
but so important. So, yes, that leads on to, although we're not telling schools what to do, apart from the reward charts, are there things that schools can do to help children either not fall into shame so much at school or to come out of it with their support quicker? Are there any suggestions that you have for schools?
Such a massive
It's
question. And I
huge.
think you need to think along two different lines for it. So there needs to be a whole school approach, which will be decided on really by the senior leaders. And that will take, that will kind of give people the direction of, whether we use reward charts, whether we reward attendance, what the behavior policy is, do we use three strikes and you're out, do we record names on the book, like those kinds of things. I think that needs to be led by senior leaders to say what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. But then I think you've got your second approach, which is where individual teachers need to really think about what messages they are sending out to children, when they have those interactions with the children, and whether it could be shame inducing. And I know that sounds like a really vague answer, but it's just like, if you hand back a piece of work where all you've done is circle a mistake and said, do this again, how does that feel? Could you take the time to put something else on as well? Could you take the time to have a conversation? I know you can't talk to all the children about all the mistakes they've made, I get that, but could we think about it a little bit differently? you know um if you are giving verbal feedback, or if someone's given the wrong answer in class, how do you respond to them to give them some validation, to kind of value them as a person, to value the contribution that they've made? Do you know what? That's a really good answer. And I can see why you've said that. It's really common. Whenever I ask this question, loads of people give me that. And I'm really glad that you have, because it's a really good teaching point. So thank you so much. And then kind of, do we do that? Or, yeah, that's quite a vague, woolly answer. We'll probably come into it a bit more, but yeah, I think you need to be very clear that there are two approaches, like a top down and a bottom up. What individual teachers say and do, and what the school leaders say is acceptable.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's got to come from the ethos, the leadership, tone, and the ethos of the school, and that commitment to understanding attachment and trauma as part of that behavior management approach, or the general ethos that they will have to supporting children. If it's not there, it's going to make everything difficult for the children that we're thinking about. So as parents, it's again, how do they choose? I suppose you've got to look at the website. Look at, if you still haven't chosen school, you'll need to look at those things and speak to people, speak to the staff there, and find out what are they, how do they operate, what are their sort of core beliefs, and that stuff is really important. But I think, it has to. So you've got to have the training. You've got to have the training there really to make it effective. I think apart from that, it really does come down to relationships. Everything's down to relationships, and there's got to be an element of building trust. Because if these children are beginning to feel a sense of trust with the adults who are in the school, that's when things will get better. That's when they'll still begin to engage a bit more and be able to negotiate, or listen or engage with situations where if they've made a bad choice, their behaviour's not been acceptable. It doesn't mean we can just say that's okay. It's not okay to behave like that, but we can deal with it in a way that they can begin to reflect slightly and slowly. But they can't do that without the relationships, and therefore it's not going to work. So it has to start with that. It's probably easier in primary schools because the natural way it works, there's that more close network of staff that they deal with. There's fewer staff that they have to work with. So it's where things, I often find, probably the work I do with adoption focus, so many of the difficulties that when I'm helping families are at secondary school, because it's just become more difficult for the children to manage, because of the number of adults that they're working with and the variability of staff who are aware of the ways that the children need to be supported. So it's fascinating when you find out that some of the children are perfectly fine in some classes and absolute nightmare in others in the same day. Well, why is that? And it's just because of their relationships with that particular class teacher. So it really is crucial. And I think probably thinking about scripts is really helpful. So yeah, knowing how to deal with situations where the children's behaviour might be more difficult is like, how do we give them that script? We try and do that as parents, don't we? As we're sort of shown in the training the kind of trauma-informed scripts we might be able to use. Like, I can see you're struggling with this, and like, or you must have some pretty big feelings, etc., etc. Trying to give that a narrative, but it's not obvious. It's not doesn't come naturally. I think as teachers, it's not something you're necessarily trained to do. So beginning to use that kind of language might just avoid exacerbating things into to make them worse, and put the child into shame beyond where they already are. I think really big thing is as well, don't ask them to say why. It's really difficult because
Mm.
it's so when I see a child's done something like thrown something on the floor or smashed something,
Why
whatever.
did you do that?
Why have you done that? Well, of course, in the moment that they can't say why because they're probably in some kind of trauma or their brainstem moment, fight, flight, whatever. It might not look like they are because they might look like they're doing it deliberately and with a smile on their face. But you, if you just try and say why have you done that, they'll just get I don't know, and it might because they generally don't know because they aren't thinking about it. They can't give a rational reason, and it just doesn't go anywhere. It's not helpful as a conversation. So you've got to find alternatives to saying why have you done that, which is what you often will just come out with immediately before you've even thought about it, and you see a child or a young person do
I
something.
think scripts around lying as well. So for me, like lies about homework, why it was it hadn't been done, and this, that, and the other, or whatever. And yet we do talk to parents about, if you call someone a liar, that is really quite shaming, isn't it? That's not going to go well.
Mm,
It's really not going to go well. It's going to make them feel a lot of shame. And for teachers to have scripts around that as well would be really helpful. You don't have to call a child out for being a liar. You don't have to call them out for being a liar in front of a class. You
no.
can find different ways of dealing with that induce shame less and more supportive.
And I think I go back to a first point, not first, an earlier point I made about teaching them, even the older ones. Yeah, I'm talking about upper primary and when you're in secondary school, they will still need teaching some of these social skills. They won't necessarily have empathy because it doesn't develop till much later on. If I remember the training, it's one of the last things to develop. And if you are developmentally delayed, then it's going to still not be there. So they might not be able to understand that their actions have these consequences on other people, and that's really difficult to deal with in this busy school environment. Um, but if you want to make it better, you've got to be able to recognize that as a gap and try and address that as well. Help them to think about what might another person feel. And I don't know. Okay, well, I think this might happen. I wonder if they felt like that. So you've got to then give them some script and narrative and see if you can begin to make some small steps in that way.
A massive change that I would like to see in schools would be some of the labelling that they use. So, having worked in secondary schools and sixth form college, I've taught a lot of children that had to do GCSE resit maths, and that can be quite shame inducing because a lot of your peers have passed it and you're being made to do it, and you find it really, really hard, and yet you've still got to keep on doing it until you pass. And I worked in a school that called it additional maths on the timetables. And it was, I mean, obviously the children still knew that they were resitting their GCSE, and the teachers still knew they were resitting their GCSE. But on the timetables and on the posters that went around school, we had A level maths, we had further maths, we had core maths, we had statistics, and we had additional maths. It wasn't putting up, yeah, you guys are still resitting your GCSE for the whole world to see. And I think that could be extended to sets as well. So, yes, children will still get a sense of which set is above the other, but instead of labeling them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, could we actually just label them something differently? Could we use colours or birds' names or something that when somebody else sees their timetable or when they have to tell people which set they're in, it's not massively, you know, because like you, Jason, like I do recognise the value in mixed ability groups, but I'm yet to work in a secondary school that will have a mixed ability group
Mm,
really on the run up to GCSEs in year 7 and 8,
yeah.
maybe, but on the run up to GCSEs, I've not seen it yet, and so okay, keep them if that's how you want to do it, but can we just just make it less shaming, please. So yeah, labeling I think would be a big one. And also, while we've been talking, I've remembered a school that I worked at. They had a really fabulous approach to sports day, because sports day can be really
Mhm.
shaming as well, can't it? Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Speaking as someone who was not sporty in any way, shape, or form growing up, I hated it. Um, but this school, you earned house points, but the numbers were ridiculously huge. So the person who came in last place might get something like 500 house points, and then second to last place might get 510, or whatever. So the points were massive, which made the number crunching very difficult for everybody involved, including teachers. But actually, the amount of difference between first and last place was relatively small. And it
Mm.
also meant that what every house wanted was someone running or competing. It didn't really matter where they came, but they wanted someone to run and compete. And that is a school where I saw children coming in last who also were not sporty, but they were being cheered by house members of all years
Mm.
because they were crossing the finish line. Yes, it was 3 minutes after everybody else, but they were getting the biggest round of applause and the biggest number of cheers because they've just earned 500 house points and it's amazing. The person
Yeah.
in
You
first
turned
place
up.
only got 560. Like, you running
Yeah.
is better than you not running. And I just thought it was a really good way to make sure that everybody who contributed was valued for their input. So yeah, that's a good way I felt of
It's a
handling
good,
sports
yeah,
day.
it's a good compromise. It still gets the opportunity for those competitive ones to do that and
Yeah,
feel like they've achieved. But the biggest contribution is then actually the fact you turn up. Yeah, great. I love that. I did see something else recently as well in a secondary school, which is when I was working with a trainee teacher, and she was working in what like a nurture group. And some secondary schools run nurture groups, and I really love it when I see them. You know, in this particular class, there was a mixture of, sort of year 7, 8, and 9, so there's quite a spread of year groups, but they were there because they had various additional needs. Now, again, it could be very difficult to put a group together and say, well, you all need special help. You know, this is a bit like a sin bin, let's say. More air quotes needed for that. But it wasn't like that. The way they set it up was so effective. And again, this all hinged on that thing I said before, relationships. She had such good relationships with this small group of children and young people who had various needs. Some had additional language needs. Many had been in the care system, were in care, etc., are vulnerable for various reasons. Now, in other classes, did not function, did not contribute, couldn't, just couldn't. But in here, I was watching her teaching. They were putting their hands up, they were speaking, they were happy to ask questions, things that they would never do because they felt safe. The bottom line, they felt safe. They could put their hand up and say something. No one else was going to turn around and go, "Oh my God, I can't believe you said that." There was none of that whatsoever. And there were some children who were then reading sections from a text. I thought, oh, it's going to be interesting. Often in a class, you're going to be very careful if you ask children to read out passages out loud because immediately you're exposing them to the fact if they can't read very fluently, everyone can hear them and is sort of awkwardly shuffling and going, oh my God. Um, so I just watched that with interest. But then there were a couple of these children who were probably 14 who read really slowly and it was very laboured, almost using a phonic approach, trying to break down the words. But nobody said a word, nobody commented. There was not the slightest hint of anyone. That contribution was brilliant. Everyone said brilliant. Thank you so much. The teacher was so positive. It was just normal. That was just how we read this way. You had a really good go, and of course that meant they were so motivated. I just loved it. I thought this is how it can be done. It can really be done, but you need that. You need to know that the school just is going to support
yeah,
a teacher to be able to operate like that because they can't operate in a standard classroom way. But for those children, it was making a huge difference. And she was explaining to me then in other discussions that often the children didn't stay in that group forever. They often went back into a mainstream setting, so mainstream classroom, sorry, because they'd got to the stage where they felt more confident and felt a bit safer,
yeah.
and so could then move. It wasn't until they were stuck forever and labelled. So I just loved that flexibility as well. So I thought as a example of good practice, that was great, and it does happen in some places, and so I'd just encourage others to try and consider it, and whether parents might ask about these sort of things as well, whether these are options available to their children if they're in secondary settings, for example.
I also think, because you said, and you made it really clear in your answer there about how like important relationships are, and I think they are just central to absolutely everything. We often say in training, someone who's been hurt or experienced trauma through a relationship, that's going to be healed through a relationship, and the
Mm.
relationship between educators and children is just really important. We are going to say things wrong. Educators are going to be marking late at night and just do
Mm.
say or write something that has accidentally shamed a child. In the heat of the moment, when you've got 30 children shouting at you, you might say the wrong thing. But actually focusing on that relationship and taking time afterwards to apologize if they have,
Mm.
and also to make it really explicit that any mistake that's been made is not who they are or is not how you view them, that you value them as a person. I just think that teachers investing in those individual relationships help support a child when they do feel shame.
Yeah.
Shame on its own in small levels is not a bad thing. It's how we learn to meet societal expectations. It's how we learn not to do dangerous things like running out in front of cars. It's because our parents have made us feel shame and they've told us off for doing it. It's not a bad thing per se, but children need the support of adults around them and good, strong relationships to be able to tolerate it. It's when they can't tolerate it and when they think that it defines who they are, that's when we start to see it having real problems and real long term implications for children. So, yeah, those relationships just really need to be focused on the teacher as a
Mm-hmm.
teacher.
You just reminded me of something else when you were saying that as well. I completely agree that I've seen other teachers recently as well who both happen to be completely separate schools, but both happen to be dyslexic, so they experience difficult um, educational experiences themselves. Were very open about it in their classrooms and the teaching, and I just thought, brilliant, I love it, because they had to model writing and had to just demonstrate how to write for the children teaching them, and had to be open about the fact they couldn't always remember how to spell or didn't know if something was spelled correctly, and knew they would get things wrong. That because obviously dyslexia affects people differently. But anyway, that in that particular instance, I thought it was great because there will be children in that classroom who will be dyslexic, and just needs to see there's a role model there that it's fine. I get it. Oh no, I've done it again, and giving them children permission to spot. Oh, well, have I got it wrong? Oh, sorry. Right, can you just help me? Let's get that right. I'll need to check that later. I'll get a dictionary. Modeling a way round it. So sort of trying to show it's okay. We don't have to be perfect. We can make fools of ourselves in front of others. It's not. We're not going to be judged.
That makes me
I'm not going to judge
smile
you.
so much because my mental arithmetic is shocking and it gets worse when I'm put on the spot. And
Mm,
obviously, as a maths teacher, I would quite often have to do an awful lot of mental arithmetic on the spot. So
yeah.
I would always be telling my classes there is a high probability that I'm going to get this wrong. And, they'd point out when I'd make mistakes. And as classes got to know me, the way that they would point out mistakes, they know to do it like sensitively, to do, and just, she's made a mistake, it's no big deal. And that would then kind of like filter down into kind of like how they treated one another. And it was
Mm,
never a plan to reduce shame. It was because I was going to make a lot of mistakes, and I just thought I'd call
yeah.
it out. But it did serve me quite well actually. And if that's something that other teachers can take on board, throw in a deliberate mistake a few times, kind of laugh at yourself a little bit, show children that it's okay to do this, then that can be really helpful for those that don't do it deliberately.
Yeah. I do see a lot more of that, I'm glad to say, in schools I've been in. There's a lot more willingness and openness for teachers to be
Human.
fallible.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's modeling it. It's modeling to the children. That's what I want from them. If I'm not modeling, if I'm showing perfection at all times, and then what am I saying to them about this is a place where it's safe to make mistakes. It's okay. It's part of what we. This is in fact what we need to do. If we're making mistakes, it means we're learning. Is that kind of ethos? Let's go back to what we said earlier about ethos. If the ethos of the school is all about that, then that can hopefully permeate through the whole school, which is what you want it to be. Because it's all very well having one great teacher that the child latches onto, but if the rest of the teachers are not able to support that child effectively later on, then there's that inconsistency, and that will not help.
How can parents help with this?
I think it probably starts. Well, know that they're the experts, aren't they, in many aspects of their child. okay? Even if they don't have an expertise in education, it doesn't matter, because they'll have, they'll know ways, forms of words, for example, that work for their children to avoid confrontations, let's say, at home. So um, they might have those kind of little scripts or forms of words that they could probably use, and maybe suggest to teachers they could use a similar form, because it's then consistent, isn't it? Which just helps then, I think, to avoid some of those unintentional situations which could be exacerbated. And as we've all said, be open, communicate with the school. We've said all those little things in the previous podcast, haven't we? But those are really important too. Developing that relationship with the staff is really key, so that you have that open dialogue.
Yeah, open dialogue is important. When my child feels shame, this is how they respond. So this
Mm,
behaviour that you're seeing, this is because they are full of shame. Um, and it can be really hard to get that message across to people sometimes, because they might just think that you're cheerleading for your child and oblivious to their faults. And so, these conversations do need to be handled sensitively, but if possible, we do need to be given those messages of, when my child feels shame, this is kind of how it exhibits. But also, I would say that, if we recognise that our child is experiencing a lot of shame at home, at school, then I think at home we need to be putting some work in to be like explicit with them that the things that are happening in school are not part of their self-worth. So actually, whatever set they're in, it doesn't matter. If they are feeling negatively about that in school, we need to be the ones at home giving the messages that they're right where they need to be. It's perfect. It's not a problem. They are lovable and they are worthwhile, whatever that number is. And also with test results, I'm sure no one listening to this would do it, but I have definitely worked with parents who were very hung up on their children's test results and would be having meetings with us because their test results weren't high enough, and wanted, and just the pressure that kind of like home were putting on. Like I say, I'm sure none of our parents are doing that, but we can handle these conversations more sensitively and undo or kind of try and repair some of the shame that they may be experiencing in
mm,
school. So, and the other thing is, sometimes we might get contacted by school where we as parents are asked to follow things up because they haven't performed or they haven't towed the line, or, whatever. And they might be wanting us to have conversations, or, I don't think a school would say that they would want us to punish them, but they're expecting some kind of follow up from us as parents. Well, as parents, how we choose to deal with our shame that a school is talking to us about that, maybe the embarrassment that we're feeling, or the worry that we have, we can choose to deal with that in a way that's not going to induce shame in our children. Home needs to be a safe place. So if
yeah,
they're feeling shame at
absolutely.
school and then we're shaming them again because of something they've done at school, then home isn't going to be safe for them. So we've got to fight our own perhaps feelings of shame or embarrassment, or worry, and try and handle that in a constructive way.
Yeah, I completely agree. Completely. Well, going back to what you said about results, though, Lisa, I think you're absolutely right. And I was just formulating a thought as you were speaking, which was about the sense that, let's say 15, 20 years time, those scores aren't going to matter really, or unlikely, very unlikely. But their ability to be able to function as an
Mm.
adult, or interact with other people, certainly will.
Mm.
That's the thing that's going to make the difference. And be able to, as functioning, hopefully well-adjusted people.
And that's it. We can find role models for children that suit their strengths, be that
Yeah.
being good with animals, be it, perhaps having really good social skills, or perhaps it's the fact that they like board games or football or art or poetry, or whatever it is that a child is interested in. We can take upon ourselves to find role models who have been good in those
Mm.
areas.
Mm-hmm.
So that can reinforce your point, Jason, that actually in 20 years' time, what you got in a history test on a Friday afternoon in November really doesn't matter.
Yes, thank you, Jason and Lisa. That's been so helpful. Thanks for listening. Hopefully today's episode gave you more insight into shame for adopted children and how you can work together with school to lessen this for your child or children. If you have any questions, suggestions, or you fancy joining us, then please do let us know. You can contact us at podcast@adoption-focus.org.uk. Thanks for listening.